One of your colleagues, is it Mason? Is that right? Was noting that it's important in thinking about Julian's visions to keep in mind that she was more a lay person than clergy. And I learned yesterday that it's not just my beloved friend and sister Rebecca Smith Hall who uses the term magic hands, that within Episcopal circles, she works with people at the seminary who are lay ministers, and one of the things she has said is that unless you have the capacity to turn the things into the other things, unless you have the capacity to do the magic, then your ministry is kind of like, eh. She said this a long time ago. I'm sure things have changed a lot. But keep in mind, Julian did not have the magic hands. Julian was not clergy. She was more laity than clergy, and that's important to keep in mind. And years ago, as I was thinking through how to explain to students in a seminar on Julian the role that Julian would have played at a busy church in a busy port city at this time, with a window that looks out onto a busy city, is that she was more, we came to the decision that maybe we should describe her, she was more like a church secretary, in that she would be there for most of the day and see people coming in and out and know a lot about what was going on with people's troubles, because she would be there and present. I don't know about y'all, but that is the churches I grew up with. That really resonated. I thought, yes, there will be people who are in the building, and the church secretary is one of them. The church administrative assistant. You get what I'm saying, right? That is maybe think of her with a pencil behind her ear, and a Rolodex. Okay. So thank you for that clarification. That was helpful. Okay. So let me do a little bit of just a summary, and then I'm going to read to you. I'm going to read to you from Watson's text again. So this again is a text I highly recommend if you want to really get into Julian of Norwich. So this translation, very, very helpful, Penguin translation, the whole thing. You can carry that around in your pocketbook. And then this is heavy and not easy to carry around, but it is, they have the Middle English and then translations and notes on the words. It's with Penn State University Press, and it would be great to have for your church library, maybe. Okay, awesome. Okay. So here, Jenkins and Watson are describing the long text, which again is not that long, in the ways that it is an expansion and rewriting of the short text. So altogether more ambitious, a revelation, or the long text, is a full-scale expansion and rewriting of the short text that may not have been begun until the middle of the 1390s and may have been finished any time between them and Julian's death after 1416. The longer text is more than 4 times the length of the shorter text and shows deep respect for the words and ideas of the short text, even as it transforms them into something new. A speculative argument, only dimly visible in the short text, about the being and nature of God, humankind, and creation. According to the longer text, the engines of transformation were 2 secondary revelations of 1388 and 1393, which together enabled Julian to resolve her puzzlement at the significance of the original revelation, the original vision. In the first of these additional things that she came to as she was working on the longer text, Julian learned that love and nothing else was his meaning. That's a quote. Love and nothing else was his meaning. And then in the second vision that she received after her original visions, she was told in re-envisioning the revelation as this message of love, she needed to focus especially on an episode she claims to have left out of the short text because she did not understand it. In this dim, hardly remembered glimpse of a truth, a servant asked to do work for his Lord sets out with such zeal to get his job done that he trips, falls, and ends up on the ground, groaning and moaning in pain at his hurt and shame at his failure. Far from being angry at him, however, his Lord pities him and promises to reward him more than he would have done if he had not fallen. It seems that in falling, the servant has not failed, but mysteriously performed the work he was given. Okay, so here is how Watson and Jenkins explain this somewhat. So, working its every detail with fierce intensity, her longer text turns this simple exemplum, or maybe parable, into a starting point of an argument of great complexity and optimism that reconstrues the nature of human sin and goodness from the ground up in bold, speculative leaps. Like the servant's fall, and here it gets complicated, okay? Like the servant's fall, which signifies both Adam's fall and Christ's incarnation, here versions of the same event. Sin is a product of inexperience, not perversion. Okay, so here's I'm going to bring back up what I brought up yesterday regarding sumptuary laws. So at this time, it was against the law to wear clothing that did not fit your station. In this vision, and it's complex, but I could spend the whole day on this and y'all be bored, so I won't do that. But in this vision, Julian sees, she claims she has seen the vision, but then she doesn't understand it, so she doesn't write about it in her short text. But then she continues to pray for some guidance on what she saw. And what she writes in many chapters of the longer text is a speculative interpretation of what it is she'd seen. And what she sees is a servant that then she sees is both Jesus and Adam. So the servant is both Jesus and Adam. And God is the Lord who sees the servant as both. So remember that, I know it is confusing. It's very confusing section. But remember that her understanding is that her vision, one of her visions is that all that is and all that ever will be and all that ever was is contained within the point that is the cross. So all time, all space is contained within a P-O-Y-N-T-E, a point that is everything, that is the cross. So everything has been collapsed in on the cross. So God never sees us apart from the cross, through which we are bled, fed, and held safely. So here is, do I need to say more on that? So what, let me think about another. There's another theologian, so I've written an essay on this that thinks analytically about Julian's understanding of grace and Thomas Aquinas's understanding of grace. And let me just, you don't have to know a whole lot about Thomas Aquinas at this point, but Thomas asks a question about whether or not we are healed first and then forgiven, or forgiven first and then healed. Believe it or not, that's actually something that theologians still to this day argue over. And what Thomas Aquinas suggests in his different thinking through the answers to that is that it depends on the perspective of the person. If the person is in darkness and the light comes, am I illumined first, or is it the case that the light, is it the case that I'm illumined because the light has come in, or am I illumined first? That's one way to think of it. But also, what Thomas suggests is that from God's perspective, it is all within an instant. It is not stages of particular progress. It is within an instant. So Julian, in the servant and the Lord passage, is describing this vision she's had that, as Watson puts it, or maybe it was Ayers, but that she receives a vision of how God sees the fall. The fallen servant is Adam and Jesus. God never sees Adam apart from Jesus, which temporally makes no sense. But in terms of her vision, it is, and here it's going to get worse, all right, if you're already puzzled. She receives the words that sin is fitting. I'm not going to be able to say it exactly right, but any Middle English scholars in the room? Behoovily. Is behoovily. It is behooving, fitting, which is really weird, right? That is not a word. I would use sin as fitting. Here's how another systematic theologian who's still alive, who is retired, British, was teaching at Yale, who wrote a book on Julian of Norwich. Give me just a second. Because he spends a lot of time on this particular question, and he and David Ayers are kind of in an ongoing argument about it. 71, 72. Okay. In his recent book on Julian's theology, Dennis Turner thinks of Julian alongside the writings of Dante, who lived and wrote about God shortly before Julian lived and wrote. Turner's section on their similar understandings of sin is helpful on what Julian avows and how her visions are not an example of disavowal. So she's not, Dennis Turner argues, it's not that she's saying there is nothing here that matters. Okay, so here is what he has to say. If we are to say that sin is a refusal of reality, this does not mean that it is in any way an unreal refusal. For to say that to live in sin is to live with an illusion is by no means the same to say that sin is illusory. Refusing reality can have every sort of real consequence, can cause every sort of pain and suffering, can weave warps and webs of fantasy and illusion, can create and sustain whole regimes of deceit, can motivate personalities disordered by such fears and self-deceptions so as to generate all the world's violence, all the world's need for it, and all the world's untold numbers of cruelties, all of which can join up into interlocked systems, into self-sustaining structures, which conspire to be a world made out of material of its unreality. Of course, then, sin is real, and there is nothing in Julian's theology that would suggest otherwise. But her saying that sin is real is perfectly consistent with her also saying that sin has no substance, no manner of being. Sin is real in the sense that an unreality can become the real substance of a person's or of a society's existence, a kind of really lived refusal of the real. Okay, end quote. Sin for Julian can become a really lived refusal of the real. I would add, and I think Turner would consider this compatible with his reading, that my really lived refusal of the real can be particularly tenacious if my naming this unreality as unreal requires me to question the faith that I've been taught. Okay. And that actually leads to one of the questions we'll get to in the question and answer period. So, yes. Okay, what did I read? Okay. So, sin for Julian can become a really lived refusal of the real. I would add that my really lived refusal of the real can be particularly tenacious in a bad way if my naming this unreality as unreal requires me to question the faith that I have been taught. I'm going to continue reading, if the self-sustaining structures of a mendacious form of Christianity have been for me a splint against the impending chaos of life, I may find it almost impossible to release my desperate grasp on this form of faith. If my particular community or practice of Christianity is intertwined with untruth, I may find it unthinkable to think in any different way. Put simply, evil is particularly hard for some Christians to face if that evil is intertwined with a version of Christian language or Christian practice that seems inextricably part of faith. Okay. I know this is a lot, but give me just 1 second. Okay, so Turner wrote in his article and book, focused carefully on what Julian means when she writes that sin is behoovely. The Middle English word is a contentious word to translate. According to one translation, Julian sees that sin is fitting. In Turner's reading, Julian's use of this term is embedded in an affirmation of a God who so devises a plot or a storyline whose sole meaning is love. He suggests that in this way, Julian situates human sin. Sin becomes fitting as part of a story. I would emphasize, along with Turner, that the fitting Julian sees has the cross as the center around which all the other parts of the story revolve. Okay, there's a lot there. So the way Dennis Turner, who has spent a lot of time on Julian of Norwich as a systematic theologian, reads her saying that sin is, from one perspective, fitting. It's that sin has been taken so up into the story, the plot line of salvation, through which we are saved by Jesus, that it no longer is the focus of our vision. Our focus of our vision is God's love, God's sympathy for us, because every fall is seen through the cross. And what I mean in that section on it can be particularly difficult to let go of an untruth when, for Christians, when that untruth has been bound up with a particular way of seeing God, and a way of seeing God that has given us a splint against some form of chaos that we're dealing with. That insight comes very much from my students at Duke who grew up fundamentalist or within forms of evangelicalism that emphasize our nothingness, and emphasize that God is all powerful. That God is all powerful. And one way to think about it, some of you have probably learned this version, that what Jesus does is come in to intercede for us because God the Father is livid with us. Right? God the Father is mad, and Jesus comes in to intervene. And if it weren't for Jesus holding God's anger back, then we would be nothing. So in my experience of teaching people who end up at a place like Duke, right? They end up at a place like Duke, which means that they were drawn to being willing to consider other ways of thinking than this very particular version of what I would call wrong-headed neo-Calvinism. It's hard for them to give up on a different kind of sense of safety, that God is bringing retribution, and Jesus stands in so we don't have to suffer the retribution. And that's just that. Julian received something completely different than that. Her emphasis is not on our insignificance. Her emphasis is not on human insignificance. All of the mundane, earthly visions she receives have to do with our blood, our bones, our bodies. And let me read to you one of the sections. How am I doing on time? 20 minutes? Eek. Okay. All right. Okay. So here's, this is from the long text, section 49. In the Penguin edition, it's page 112. Okay. For this is what I was shown, that our life is all grounded and rooted in love, and without love we cannot live. And therefore, to the soul which through God's special grace sees so much of his great and marvelous goodness and sees that we are joined to him in love forever, it is the greatest impossibility conceivable that God should be angry. For anger and friendship are two contraries. It must needs be that he who wears away and extinguishes our anger and makes us gentle and kind in himself, always consistently loving, gentle, and kind, which is the contrary of anger. For I saw quite clearly that where our Lord appears, everything is peaceful and there is no place for anger. For I saw no kind of anger in God, neither for a short time nor for a long time. Indeed, it seems to me that if God could be even slightly angry, we could never have any life or place or being. Okay. So, I know I've probably left a lot of you with many more questions than answers, but let me give you one more way to think about the fittingness. So, a basic assumption that Julian works from is that God created everything out of nothing, and that God recreates us daily through the blood and the body out of nothing. So God has created us out of nothing. So the plot line of salvation, the story of all that is being brought into the cross, means that all of time is such that none of us have to be here. And God didn't have to do anything. We are God's whimsy. We are God's whimsy. We did not have to exist. We do not have to have life. It pleases God for us to exist. And we didn't have to be. None of us has to be. And that, to me, is very freeing. I am gratuitous. I am God's whimsy. We are God's whimsy. Non-necessary. Complete non-necessity. And there are theologians after her who envision this, and but I'd say it's while there are theologians who envisioned creation out of nothingness, her emphasis on God's familiarity with us and God's way of seeing us is, to my mind, a very helpful set of visions and really worth continuing to look at. Okay, now, I had a bunch of questions that people have asked, but I'm gonna read to you one more thing, and then I'll answer some questions. Okay. Give me just a second. I'm going to read you, I think I have the whole poem. I'm going to read to you from one other poet here. Okay. Okay. This is a poem it's hard for me to read without tearing up. So, all right, so Vassar Miller is another poet. She was a contemporary of Denise Levertov. And here is a poem that I say whimsically makes clear the understanding of grace that Julian has called me towards. The poem by Vassar Miller is called Delayed Gratitude, and it appears in a collection of her poems entitled If I Had Wheels or Love. I'm sorry, y'all. Become the friends of small things. I take crickets and gnats for topic. Even the ant arched by my dog's armpit, for whom I could write an epic, and thereby give him a voice, which none ever did for the ant, even the Lord, who made vocal cords creation somewhat aslant. But he shall surely speak through my verses. You can like it or lump it. The ant no child hears with ears still magic. My poem shall prove his trumpet, for he earns it. This ant, he and every other animated caprice. To me, even their limited warfare, being a gesture of peace. So, every other animated caprice. That is who we are. We are animated caprices. Thank you. Okay, I have questions that I've received. I think I've dealt with the sin is nothing, not in a way that has pleased most of you, perhaps, but in a way that at least will help you be interested in reading more of her writing. So I received 2 other questions. How unusual was Julian's God at the time? It feels like he doesn't really get mad, though I may have kind of answered this, and it's mostly humans beating ourselves up in her view of things. That's not how I imagine people at the time thinking of God. So one of the things, it's a great question. One of the things that to keep in mind is we don't know all the ways that people were thinking about God at the time. And so it is very possible that there were people thinking about God as all loving and not as angry. It is very possible that there were, and I imagine there are some historians of this period in England who would be able to point to some examples of images of images. That would be where I would go first, is to think about what were some of the ways that artists who were creating the buildings and the images in churches or adding things to the churches at this time, what would be some of the images that would be of God's pleasure rather than God's anger? That's probably where I would go to look. So also, this is another great question, and very different questions from one. Do you want to take credit for these are your questions? Okay, well, do you mind? Do you mind saying these are your questions? Thank you for your good questions. Thank you. What's your first name again? Sorry? What's your first name again? Giselle. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So how do you read Julian's extreme piety? She downplays her own role and is quick to clarify that she isn't contradicting the church's teachings. Do you think this is all genuine, or that she exaggerates it to get her book accepted? I don't have an answer to that. But there are the fact that she did not write about the servant and Lord passage, the fact that she did not write about that vision in the beginning, and that she genuinely, she tells us in the long text that she dwelt on this vision that there is no anger in God, and that God is all loving, and that sin is somehow fitting. She tells us that she's been thinking on this for a long time. So I think it's fair to make an educated guess that she was concerned about how her texts would be received. And one way to think about this too, y'all, is if Christians at this time, or maybe today, started suggesting that it's all grace upon grace upon grace. I mean, certainly at this time, the church was using their power. The church was using the whole apparatus of piety to enforce compliance and obedience, even on something so simple as having the text in the vernacular. I just do want to be clear that not everything gets solved when the Church of England is created. So I just want to, it's not like everything's like, woohoo, it's all good. Not really. I'm sure y'all already knew that. But just in case somebody doesn't know that, I'll just note that. But there are points where that's exactly how I read her. I read her as saying, but what do I know? I am. She doesn't do that really very often in the long text. In the long text, there's less of that from my perspective as I read her. So some people have read her disclaimers as suggesting that she couldn't read English, and that's one of the reasons why I suggest that we say she composed these visions, because we don't know for sure that she wrote the words. She might have composed them and spoke them to somebody else. Okay, other questions? So tell me, there's another person. Tell me your first name again, I'm sorry. Tina? So Tina asked, let me get it about Tina asked a question about Julian's visions for today. Do you want to tell people how you? Mm-hmm.
Horizontal violence is how we make decisions. So part of it is like, how can we take this idea of sin is nothing? And how can we take this idea that love is everything? And how can we take this idea that we're beloved before we're healed? Like all the, and what can it look like in our communities? And what can it look like in our life, our prayer? Like just, I guess I'm sitting with the what now? What do we do with all this? With all of this like lovely revelation?
So I've been heartened by the playful theatrics of chicken costumes and inflatable frogs. I've been heartened by that response. I'll tell you a very quick story on myself. So during the recession, Duke administrators, some of them, decided during the recession to push staff into early retirement. We just went through another round of that this summer. But during the recession, it turns out a muckraking journalist did, for the local paper, exposed that during the recession, while librarians and people who work as housekeepers were being asked to do twice as much work for the same amount of pay, there were executives in the top giving themselves giant bonuses. And it came out in the local paper, and several of us were thinking about what to do, and I said, I'm not up for another candlelight vigil. I was just like, candlelight vigil for truth in the midst of greedy people being greedy. And so they gave themselves giant bonuses. What we decided to do was do 3 street theaters. And I'll just tell you about the first one. We did a toast out in front of Duke Chapel to the billionaires who'd managed to come out on top with top hats and tiaras and fake champagne to toast them, because during a time of scarcity, they managed to come out on top. And it happened to be at the same time, we filmed it. It's really, I'll send you the videos if you're interested. But, and we took a giant gold check to the chancellor of the medical center to congratulate him for getting a giant bonus during a time of recession. And like, congratulations, Victor Zhao, that you managed to come out on top. We also brought him flowers, and brought flowers for his administrative assistant, who was going to have to be dealing with us. We brought her a really nice thing of flowers. But it happened, it was at the same time when one of the very vocal anti-Christian writers, I can't remember, was it Dawkins? I can't remember which one, but there was a speaker who was coming to Duke as a celebrated speaker to speak on campus about how Christianity sucks. And it was, some of my colleagues were like, we must address this, we must speak, we must debate him, we must, and I was just like, oh, blah, blah. So part of what we did was mock the whole apparatus of social Darwinism that suggests that the strong come out on top. We mocked it all by giving a toast to the fittest of the fit who come out on top in front of Duke Chapel. And it just happened, we also very fortuitously had some bagpipers somehow and showed up. I was like, oh, that wasn't expected, but we'll receive it. So I think Mel Brooks, who I love Mel Brooks so much. Listening to him helps me believe in all sorts of good things. So Mel Brooks, when asked sometimes about his wackadoo sense of humor, he will, if you don't know who Mel Brooks is, you can look up Spaceballs, maybe, one of many Mel Brooks's creations. And he basically says the best way to respond, and realize Mel Brooks did not grow up, he is not up here in power, right? He's a Jewish comedian, like growing up with vaudeville. Like vaudeville is a good reaction, a good response to the nonsense of evil. The nonsense of evil. And that's one of the things that Mel Brooks has said, is that when faced with this nonsense that is evil, is to lampoon it, I mean, the Dadaists, now I'm like, but anyway, look up Dadaism, because I think there are ways to respond to systemic evil that we have models for, and I think whimsy, as animated caprices, whimsy is one way, not the only way. I'm not trying to say this is the only way. I'm a member of the ACLU, and I do everything I can to convince people to contribute to the NAACP Defense Fund, and also I'm always looking at what LULAC is having to say, because I grew up with LULAC doing an audit of San Angelo High School and forcing changes at San Angelo High School in the 1980s. So I'm not saying like there aren't very clear systemic ways to address evil and injustice, but it's also the case that what y'all are doing in here, it's the way Marva Dawn puts it in her book on worship, is we're engaging in a royal waste of time. A royal waste of time. So are we now right about at the time? Or do we have time for another question, or what? Okay. Yes?
So I'm very curious if you got any response to the demonstration.
Oh, we did two more. We did one where we did a bake sale for billionaires and sold cookies to give money to the billionaires so that they would stay at Duke and not leave and go someplace else. And then we did one based on the Newsies, where we dressed up as Newsies. And so a few, was it maybe within a year? I'd have to think back at the time, but eventually Duke, because Duke had frozen, the administration had frozen all raises, and eventually they release the freeze on all raises. And quite a few of us were like, yeah, we helped accomplish that. Because it ended up being on the front page of one of the sections, at least, of the Raleigh paper, the third one, the Newsies one did. So, was it effective? Maybe. Was it satisfying? Definitely.
I almost feel like that tone of, like, disempowering evil through mockery and rebuke is kind of related to what you were saying about sin as a no thing. Like, it's almost like a disempowering. It is real, but I'm not going to allow it to get the last word.
Yes. Yes. And there's been, so I can't remember the name of the man who's running in Maine. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? It's in Maine and not New Hampshire. Oh my gosh, my West Texas is showing. But yes, I know. It starts with a P, right? So you eventually, I'll look it up and I'll try to remember to bring it. But there were some people who were fussing about him. They were fussing that he's ex-military and I think is saying so many of the right things about how we need to pull together. And one of the things he said at a town hall that a lot of people were angry about, maybe in part because he's calling for taxing the billionaires, so you can kind of get people angry if you pay them to be angry about things. So, but they were supposedly angry that he had said that this is not a time to shame our neighbors. This is not a time to shame our neighbors. And I thought of that as a good friend of mine who's she's the minister who ministers to ministers in Michigan for the United Church of Christ, and she wrote a piece about how she was not surprised with the recent election. She was not surprised because she had been driving across the state of Michigan and seen so many homes that were clearly not expensive homes with very large signs out in front. She wasn't surprised at the election because she had seen how many people who she knew were in economic straits were making it very clear how they were going to vote. And so one other thing I would say is that be playfully mocking, or whatever word to use, at the right people, and not at your neighbors, if you have any neighbors who were exhibiting very clearly who they were going to vote for. Think about why, what was going on. There are answers that are very clear. I mean, surprise, people are racist and sexist. It's like, yes, we are. And there's a level of desperation that is really clear. And I think shaming people who voted in desperation is not going to help us as a country. I just said that. I don't usually talk that way. Yeah. Okay, on that note, I will be back with you to preach tomorrow. So, thank you.